Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys another catch-up review where I talk about several albums that were dropped earlier this year that for one reason or another I didn't have a chance to give a full review to, so instead I cover them here in this segment, pretty much just share my thoughts with them in a manner that tries to be brief but oftentimes isn't. But yeah, that's pretty much how things go here on this segment of my channel. So let's get started with the first album I want to talk about here today. I want to make sure I have enough time to talk about all of these records as much as I can. We're talking about the newest record from Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? Now, I primarily checked out this record just because it seems like everyone has an opinion on this thing and Billie Eilish as a whole. She's a newer pop star out there with a bit of an alternative edge to her. That sounded like something that I could see myself being interested in, so I figured, why not give it a listen and see what all the fuss is about here. I know that there are some people out there that really like this thing. I know there's some people out there who really didn't like this thing, so I was kind of interested to see where I would fall on that spectrum. Overall, I think that this is a decent album and one that has a lot of potential in it. However, I don't think the potential is fully showcased here on this project. I think it's decent, like I said before. However, I think Billie Eilish could certainly do better based on what she showcases at times here on this project. I know some people aren't exactly into the whole aesthetic that Billie has going for here on this project, this kind of creepier, kind of edgy, if you will, aesthetic. However, I don't think it's a particularly bad one overall. I think it's kind of interesting, and there definitely aren't any, at least pop stars out there with an aesthetic quite like this one. So Billie at least has something interesting and unique going for her here on this album. And I like how the production across this thing, for the most part, tends to reflect this dark atmosphere in a way that I think is really nice. And I also think it pairs up really nicely with her vocals and performances for the most part on the majority of these songs. And I also think Billie singing on this thing is another one of the most consistently strong aspects of this project as a whole. There are a couple moments I don't exactly care for that I'll get to later on, but for the most part I think her singing here on this project is really solid. I think the opening part of this album is probably the strongest segment overall. The first full-length song that you get on this thing, Bad Guy, is a pretty great song overall. I like the kind of dark but at the same time quirky beat that this track has, and I like Billie's performance over it. It's a track that overall has that dark feel that's present on a lot of these songs, but it's also really playful in a sense too, and it definitely gives me the impression that Billie is at least somewhat aware of the darker atmosphere that she tries to pull in on this project, and she's not taking it 100% seriously. She kind of knows how to have fun with it, and that's something that I really enjoy. The track Zanny that immediately follows this one is a song that with repeated listens has cooled on me a bit, but I still think it's a decent track overall. I think some of the vocal manipulations put on her voice here on this song sound pretty unique overall, and they add a bit more texture to the track that I don't think would be there otherwise. And the track that immediately follows this one, You Should See Me in a Crown, is probably the track where Billie is going the hardest overall with her delivery and the beat, and it all sounds pretty nice here as well. I think after this point on the album, however, things start to become a bit more of a mixed bag. There are some songs later on the track listing that I think are still pretty solid. Take, for example, Bury a Friend or All the Good Girls Go to Hell, for example. However, there are some other songs later on the track listing that either I don't care for or maybe have some elements that I like in them but other elements that I don't particularly care for. A big example of this is the track My Strange Addiction, which when it comes to the actual music on this song, I think it's pretty decent. I think Billie's singing is pretty nice. I think the chorus is pretty catchy. The instrumental is pretty decent as well. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the samples that are incorporated into this song that are taken from The Office. Now, I don't watch The Office myself. I don't really care for the show overall. And as a result of that, I didn't really know what was going on here with these samples. I didn't know what they were trying to do, what they were trying to add to the song's overall meaning. Apparently, it does tie back into the song's overall themes and message. However, I really couldn't tell that myself just listening to this thing on its own because nothing about the skits really get the point across in a really clear manner to someone who maybe hasn't seen this show, which I kind of wish was the case, that maybe she had picked something, the sample that made the theme of the track a bit more apparent, even to people who maybe weren't familiar with the sample. Either that or just she decided to not go with the sample at all, because I do think it kind of gets in the way of some of the stronger aspects of this song. I still feel like the track is maybe one of the stronger cuts overall in the track listing because of the, hook of the track, and her performance on the song is still pretty solid, but overall, I do feel like the skits kind of hold it back. The final 3 tracks on this album are another example of songs that I think kind of taken on their own are okay tracks overall. However, I'm not the biggest fan of how they're structured here in the album. They're all just slower, more introspective ballad-like tracks that are paired back to back to back at the end of this thing. They kind of blur together for me personally. They're just not as interesting overall as a result of that. I kind of wish that maybe she had just taken what was going on here in these 3 songs and condensed it down to 1 or maybe 2 tracks, and then maybe split them up in the track listing somewhere. I think the ideas that she has going on here in these songs aren't particularly awful, just taking 1 track by itself, and I think her performances on these tracks are still pretty great overall. However, overall, these last 3 tracks just didn't do a whole ton for me personally. The track Wish You Were Gay has some interesting ideas in it for sure, especially when it comes to the lyrics. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the instrumental of this track and how upbeat and happy it sounds, just because I feel like it really doesn't pair up nicely with a lot of the other instrumentals and the rest of the vibe of this album. The song just feels really out of place on the record, I guess, and I just kind of wish it wasn't there as a result of that. And besides that point, I still don't feel like the performances on that track are the strongest on the album overall. However, I will say that it is definitely better than my least favorite song on the album, which is 8, which is the only song on this album I think I outright really dislike overall. Once again, the instrumental to this track is a bit different than everything else on the project. It sees some ukuleles coming in to the fray. It's a bit more upbeat sounding, and throughout this track, Billie is doing something with her voice where it just sounds really high-pitched, kind of like a baby voice of sorts, and I just don't like how it sounds at all. It's just not pleasant to me in the slightest, really, and I dislike how it really doesn't match up nicely with the rest of the vibe of the album. It's like the worst 21 Pilots ukulele ballad with really bad baby singing put over it, which is really disappointing because, like I said, a lot of the rest of this project I feel like at the very least is solid and enjoyable, but on this track it doesn't have the production and the atmosphere that I like on the rest of this project. Billie's singing isn't really that great on this track either. It's kind of commendable that she stepped out of her comfort zone, I guess, with this song, because it is different than everything else on the track listing, but still, I don't think it's an experiment that worked. Overall, I think this is an okay project. It certainly has some moments on it that I think are really good overall, some tracks that are really enjoyable, and I could see myself coming back to again in the future. However, there are also some moments on this thing that I just feel like are kind of underwhelming, just not as interesting, or maybe just kind of stick out in not in a good way necessarily, because either the atmosphere is a bit different than the rest of the project, or just because it doesn't sound very good at all. I think that Billie Eilish definitely has a lot of potential in her, and I think that she could definitely make a great album one day with a lot of this potential. She definitely has the vocals to do so, she definitely has the unique vibe and atmosphere to do so, and she definitely has the production too as well. I just hope that one day that ends up happening, because here I think this is a pretty solid start, but I think she could still do better. But yeah, that's pretty much what I thought about this new Billie Eilish record. If it sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend that you check it out. But if not, like I said, I don't think it's one of my favorites of the year or anything like that. Moving on, though, the next project we're going to be talking about is this new EP from Simple Creatures entitled Strange Love. This is a music project that kind of slipped under my radar at first, though I'm kind of surprised it did, considering it's a collaborative music project between Mark Hoppus of Blink-182 fame, most notably, as well as Alex Gaskarth of All Time Low fame. They're both vocalists in their respective bands. I like both of their respective bands to varying extents, so a collaboration between the two I thought would be, at the very least, pretty enjoyable, especially considering that Blink-182 are a pretty big name in pop-punk, especially from the 90s, the early 2000s, around that time, and All Time Low followed later on in the 2000s and were definitely inspired by Blink-182 in their sound. So it's pretty interesting to see what they're going to do here on this project. Was it going to be like a, an older figure in the scene and a younger figure kind of teaming up to make something really interesting and special, or maybe it was just going to be like a celebration of pop punk in general? Overall, none of that is what happens here on this EP. This EP is terrible, it's awful, and I'm really surprised that these two, that, for the most part, I've liked their past material. I'm surprised that they were able to put out material together that was this bad. This is one of the most nondescript, uninteresting, and bland pieces of pop or pop rock that I've heard in a recent memory. Maybe even like ever since I've started this channel. Like, this is even more boring than like the most recent album from Maroon 5 a couple years back. And you know, I really did not like that project because it was really boring and bland. But this is somehow even worse to me, despite the fact that it's shorter, it's only an EP, and the people involved with this thing have made music before that I really enjoy in their previous bands. And don't get me wrong, Blink-182 and All Time Low's more recent output hasn't exactly been my cup of tea necessarily. I thought California was a pretty average record, though I did think the deluxe edition, or at least the new tracks added to that, were an improvement. And I thought All Time Low's Last Young Renegade was a pretty boring pop rock record. But this is significantly worse than either of those records. The instrumentation on this thing is pretty much a bunch of really bland, really sterile electronic synth sounds. Occasionally you'll get like a guitar mixed in there somewhere. However, it's so overproduced, it's so sterile sounding that it doesn't actually sound like it's being played by someone there. It sounds like it was just mixed into this like electronic poppy mass of a instrumental that these two are singing over. And I say singing in the loosest way possible, because their voices on this thing are just lathered in so many effects and auto-tune that you could barely tell who's singing at times on this thing. Their voices lose any of the natural aspects to them that are enjoyable to begin with. And while I don't think either of these two are necessarily, you know, the best singers in the world or anything, they do have distinct voices that I think, if you had told me I was going to be getting a project from these two where they're singing together, I think that they would have some interesting chemistry, because their voices aren't very similar, and they'd be able to pull off some pretty interesting stuff together. Kind of like earlier Blink-182 with Tom DeLonge in the band, how he and Mark Hoppus definitely had some different vocal styles and were able to do some interesting things as a result of that. However, on this project, like I said, they're so lathered in vocal effects and things of that sort that they lose anything natural and interesting about their voices. And I'm not completely against vocal effects and things like that. I think if it sounds good and if it has a really interesting purpose and reason to be on an album, it could be a very good thing. However, that's not the case here, because it makes these two sound really bland, really sterile. It makes them lose anything that made their voices interesting and stand out to begin with. It just sounds like you have a bunch of robots crooning over these really dull, lifeless pop rock instrumentals. The lyrics on this thing are really bland and generic as well. So many instances of cliches and just very typical themes popping up on this thing. Take, for example, on the track Ether, you have Mark Hoppus singing, "I'm just one drop in the ocean, I'm just one fish in the sea." Like, how did they come up with the lyrics for this thing? Were they just rattling a bunch of cliches off their heads and writing them to paper and then singing them? Because it seems like the lyrics on this thing had absolutely no time put into them at all. Also, so many instances of them just going like nah, nah, nah over and over again to fill up space here in these tracks. Just a bunch of non-lyrics. It's a really tedious listen, this project. Despite the fact that it's only like 20 minutes long, it feels so much longer because so little happens on this thing. It sounds really overproduced, really bland. Nothing really stands out in these tracks as a result of that. The hooks don't really have much punch to them because everything just feels so overblown to begin with. The lyrics suck. The fact that these two, who are pretty talented, came together and made something that was significantly worse than what they've been able to do on their own, or at least with different projects in the past, is kind of concerning to me, honestly. And despite the fact that I like these two and some of their past musical works, I can't recommend this project at all. Even the, you know, die-hard fans of All Time Low and Blink-182 or any other projects that these two have been related with in the past, this really won't offer you anything new. This is just some really generic, really watered down, really uninteresting pop music. And like I said, even the most recent output from Maroon 5 feels like it has more of a personality than this. And when I'm praising modern Maroon 5, you know that something is seriously wrong, and it's this EP in this case. So yeah, I don't recommend you listen to this, even if you're like the most diehard fan of these guys, because you won't really get much out of it overall. hoping that if these guys ever decide to drop a full-length album, that they put a bit more effort into it, and that hopefully none of the tracks from this EP will end up on that album, because that would be an album I don't really want to hear. Up next, the final project I want to talk about is the newest album from PUP, Morbid Stuff. I checked out this album because I heard a lot of really positive things about it, and because a lot of more modern pop-punk out there doesn't do a whole ton for me personally. I was hoping that I could add this to my collection of pop-punk albums that are modern that I also happen to enjoy. However, after giving this thing several listens, unfortunately, I can't really say I'm behind this album as much as other people are. I mean, I think it's an average project overall. It's certainly not a bad album by any means, but still, this album really just did not do a whole ton for me personally. The album just sounds really typical and plain to me for pop punk. I mean, there's a bit of a post-hardcore like edge to some of the songs here, but still, I mean, there's lots of other pop punk bands that do that kind of thing. So the overall sound of this project, outside of a couple of tracks, really just felt kind of bland and uninteresting to me overall. The lyrics on this thing were another thing that I kind of had mixed opinions on. On one regard, I like the fact that they have a topic, which is, Morbid Stuff, the title of the album, and they stick to it throughout the length of this project. This project is consistently negative, angry, upset, all of that kind of stuff. And I like how they focus on that, and they're able to keep everything focused on that one topic throughout the album's entire run. On the other hand, I'm not the biggest fan of the topic that they choose to focus on here in this album. Not necessarily because I'm not a negative person or anything like that. There's plenty of negative music out there that I happen to like and enjoy and listen to a lot. However, I feel like with this album, it's just kind of tiring to listen to overall. Not in the sense that it's so negative that it wears you out, more so that what they're doing here just isn't really all that exciting or new when it comes to the lyrics, so I just find it kind of boring and uninteresting. Really, I couldn't relate to or enjoy a lot of the lyrics on this thing, despite the fact that I liked how consistently focused they were throughout the length of this project. And there are even some examples of lyrics on this thing that I just thought were outright not very good overall. For example, from the track See You at Your Funeral, it has these lyrics that I thought were just kind of awkward overall. What were you thinking when you saw me at in the produce section, buying organic food, making healthy selections? And the thing about it is that these lyrics are just kind of snarled in a really nasty and bitter manner, which I guess wouldn't be that bad of a thing if the lyrics weren't so odd and out of place. It just feels really strange having those lyrics sung the way that they are, and it kind of ends up being funny, but like not in a good way. And the vocals throughout this project are another aspect that I'm not super hot on overall. I think they're like fine, I guess, but I'm not the biggest fan of the really nasally tone that they have overall. It's just not a tone of vocals and pop punk that I particularly enjoy, and this album really isn't an exception to that. The instrumentals are another part of this project that I think are pretty underwhelming overall as well. They're not terrible, but once again, they're just not super interesting to me. There are a couple of exceptions to this, however, the biggest example being the track Full Blown Meltdown, which has this very angry, aggressive, almost metal-like sound to it with how thick and heavy the guitars are on this thing. I'm still not the biggest fan of the lyrics here on this track, but the sound and the vibe of this track is good enough to make up for it. And the closing track, City, incorporates some slower, more atmospheric electronic elements that I think work really nicely as well. And I like how this track manages to maintain the really negative feel of the rest of the project and remain focused in that regard, but at the same time, it's not overbearingly negative to the point where it just sounds boring. Especially given that's the last track, I'm really happy that it was able to do that. It does leave the album off on a really nice note, in my opinion, even if a lot of the music that preceded it just doesn't interest me a whole ton. There are a couple of other moments on this thing outside of those couple of tracks that I think are pretty okay or decent overall. Some other tracks that maybe because they have a catchy hook or a slightly more interesting instrumental, I think stand out a little bit more on this thing. Particularly tracks like Bloody Mary, Kate and Ashley, or Sibling Rivalry, for example. I think these are decent tracks. Not some of my favorites of the year or anything, but fine enough songs. But yeah, outside of a couple of tracks on this thing that I thought were particularly standout, a lot of this project just didn't do anything for me. It didn't really move me, didn't really excite me, didn't really interest me all that much. I think if you're a fan of pop punk, you should still check this album out because pretty much everyone else out there seems to think that this is like the best pop punk album of the year right now, but for me personally, I don't know, I was just pretty indifferent towards it at the end of the day. But But yeah, if you're a fan of this genre, I would still say check this out because a lot of other people seem to be liking it. And with that said, that concludes today's catch-up review. If you happen to have any opinions on any of these projects that are different than my own, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.